So the question is, where does all of this lead? Where does this ever-growing demand for raw materials and new markets, this toxic mix of nationalist pride and racist justification, as well as this growing gap in military and industrial technology lead? Well, where it leads is to essentially the full scale colonization of the African continent and the almost full scale colonization of the Asian continent. So the scramble for Africa begins in the late 1870s, and thanks to their technological advantages, Western European states are pretty easily able to overwhelm the native population. They build tens of thousands of miles of railroad that allow them to penetrate the interior of the African continent. And the conflict that comes out of this is settled at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where essentially all of the major colonial powers in Africa sit down and redraw the map of Africa with no thought to the cultural or social makeup that already exists among the colonized people, but essentially just redrawing it to fit their existing wants and needs. Now, the same thing on a less democratic scale happens in the Pacific Ocean and Southeast Asia. Um, in these areas, again, this is just simply a race for supremacy. The colonizing nations use their technological advantages to colonize and to wipe out much of the native existing population and claim this land as quickly and readily as possible. The Asian mainland sees essentially the same treatment. The British occupation of India, which had begun on a very, very small scale in the 16th and 17th century, ramps up dramatically in the 19th century as the Mughal Empire starts to slowly fall apart. The British begin pushing out the French and the Portuguese, and once they are the sole colonizing power, they use bribes in economic incentives as well as some military force to basically dismantle what remains of the Mughal Empire and completely take over the entire Indian subcontinent. And then even China, who has been the dominant power in Asia and economically the dominant power worldwide since, I don't know, roughly 1500 BC, also begins to lose land and power to these industrializing Western countries. Russia begins to make inroads into northern China in the late 1800s. The French and the British begin to expand their claims north from India and Vietnam. The Japanese, after their conquest of Korea, go to war against China in the early 1900s more than once. And even the greatest civilization in Asian history succumbs at least somewhat to the onslaught of industrialization and mechanized imperialization. Now, in terms of what this colonization looks like, there are two very distinct methods of colonization. There's indirect colonization and direct colonization. And depending upon the cultural and political situation in these areas, different Western states take different approaches, right? The most common and the most widespread was what's known as indirect colonization. This is where the state takes no direct governing power within the colony. They have control. The colony answers to the mother country, but the actual state itself, the government does not get directly involved in the day to day running of the colony. It's generally done through economic control of the resources, the wage market, the population. And in a lot of cases, especially in the early years in India, this is mainly managed by corporations and private plantations like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, right? Um, you see this in the Pacific Islands, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. Again, this is mainly economic imperialism. It begins through trade, but then is finalized through military conquest. Usually, the managing of these colonies is left to some large scale corporation. Again, in India, the same thing happens as the British move in. They prefer to use economic methods to gain control rather than military because because of the overwhelming population difference in India versus British settlers. So this is again mainly economic control. The British would buy large chunks of land, rent that land out to poor farmers at very high interest rates, drive them into debt. Um, this forces people off land that they've lived on for generations. They then essentially are forced to go back and work for these new British landowners at extremely low wages. Now, this doesn't last forever. In 1857, there is a large scale revolt among what's known as the Sepoy community. These are Indian nationals who have been recruited into the British Army to help manage the colony. A huge portion of them in northern India revolt against the British, and this eventually forces the British to take direct control over the colonies. Another place where you see this is in China in the early 20th century. The Western nations begin to carve up what they call spheres of influence, where they have no direct governance in that area. It's still under Chinese control, but the Chinese are forced to accept very unfair treaties where British and French and Japanese nationals are, basically free to ignore Chinese law. They're free to essentially do whatever they want within these spheres of influence. South and Central America also sees a form of this indirect imperialism. There is no real, how would we say, imperialism in South and Central America and even in the Caribbean. But what you do see is such large scale investment on the behalf of European and American corporations that they begin to essentially buy entire governments. Probably the best example of this would be U.S. sugar in Cuba. Um, U.S. Sugar is the world, at one point is the world's largest sugar producing corporation. And the majority of their sugar production is done on the Cuban mainland. Um, and this becomes the case in 1898 after Cuba is quote unquote liberated from Spain in the Spanish American War. Now, Cuba is liberated and you know, it becomes a democratic republic in the model of the United States, but the president of Cuba basically serves at the wishes of the United States and the president of U.S. Sugar Corp. Presidents who are friendly to foreign investment, especially U.S. foreign investment, are given money and power, and basically corrupted presidents who are unfavorable to foreign investment are usually pressured out of office. Sometimes, you know, openly threatened by U.S. corporations and the U.S. government until they become friendly to U.S. investment. Now, in some areas, direct control is necessary. This is more often the case in Africa, where the native population of colonized people tend to be more resistant of colonization and imperialism. In the case of direct control, this is where Europeans set up a direct colonial government inside the colony. They set up Western legal and political systems. They enforce it with military power. They bring social and cultural pressure on the people to convert to this Western way of life. through public education, through missionaries, right? Now, the thing is, unlike in the Americas, where disease cleared a path for colonizers, no such thing happens in Africa and in Asia. So the Europeans, even in their own colonies, are a heavy minority in terms of population. So they depend on local aristocracy for their help in managing these colonies. In Africa, what does this look like? Well, this is direct war and subjugation of cities. This is a village by village military subjugation. The people of Africa are economically enslaved, and we'll talk about that when we get to the labor systems. Christian missionaries and European schools push cultural assimilation, they push social control, they push new norms onto these people in order to get them to, fall in line with this new Western way of life. Another way that Europeans do this is by dividing the population ethnically, what the book calls tribalization. And in a lot of these colonies, what happens is you have Europeans promoting and educating the more light skinned ethnicities to positions of power based on, again, this kind of this social Darwinistic idea of racial supremacy. And that's going to create long-term ethnic problems within Africa after the colonization period is over. Again, the same thing happens in Southeast Asia. You have the forced overthrow of established governments replaced with European governors. This invites the investment of European corporations, large scale manufacturing. And this basically, is the beginning of the end for native business as well. Now, a lot of what we're talking about here is going to sound very familiar, because it's going to sound very similar to what happened in the Americas in the 16th century. And imperialism in the 19th and colonialism in the 16th century is very similar, right? But there are pretty distinct differences, and it's really important that you're able to describe those differences, right? So the first and most obvious difference is there is no mass dying of the native population, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. Um, Africans and Asians had exposure to common European diseases. They had been trading with Western Europeans and Mediterranean Europeans for centuries, if not thousands of years. So, this is part of the reason why you have the method of indirect imperialism, because even in these colonies, which they control politically, the Europeans and the Americans are far and away the minority in terms of population. Another big difference between the two is there is only a small bit of resettlement of Europeans. Okay. So there is no large scale, there is no mass migration of Europeans from Western Europe or the Americas to these new colonial possessions, unlike how there was in the Americas. The native population is subjugated, they are economically enslaved, but again, they are still the minority. Another big and important difference here is that imperialism in this era is driven by industrial success. Okay. The more heavily industrialized these countries are, the more successful they are with integrating industrialization into their society and especially into their military, is what breeds their success in the 19th century, as opposed to the 16th century, where discovery and exploration were the keys to success. This is why in 16th century America, Spain and Portugal have massive colonial possessions, because they were the first to fully explore and to begin fully colonizing the Americas. While in the 19th century, you have Great Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, who are very successful because they more successfully industrialize their society than countries like Portugal, Spain, or Russia, who for the most part are left out in the 19th century. And then probably the most distinctive and longest lasting difference in 19th century imperialism versus 16th century colonialism is that there is far less mixing on the racial level. There is no mestizo class. There is no social casta in these new colonies in Africa and Asia. Um, the races in these new colonies are highly segregated beyond the family level. They're segregated politically in terms of having separate legal systems, having separate sets of laws for Indians versus British or Africans versus British. Um, Colonized people are basically for, in lots of places, they are held back and they are restricted from taking positions within government higher than a certain level. Socially, they are segregated in terms of public schools. Native children do not go to school with um, colonial children. There are segregated living areas, especially in certain colonies like South Africa, where apartheid becomes the norm. They're economically segregated as well. Certain businesses and certain restaurants are restricted to whites only, and there are separate accommodations for the colonized people. And this makes sense when you cast it in the context of this social Darwinism, right? The people in these colonies take this kind of racial superiority very seriously, and they don't want to see any dilution of their superior white genetics by mixing with the people in these colonized settings.